that exist for examining coastal flood exposure. And then we'll turn it over to Peter Slovinsky from the Maine Geological Survey to take a look at some of the Maine specific resources and data and tools that exist for examining Maine coastal hazards. Then we'll hear from Jeremy Gabrielson from the Maine Coast Heritage Trust about land conservation for resilience and marsh migration. And then Jeremy Bell from the Nature Conservancy to walk us through the Coastal Risk Explorer tool. And then hand it over to Jake Aman from the Wells Reserve to hear some information about data and tools for tidal restrictions and crossings. Then we'll take a quick 5-minute break and come back and hear again from both Danny, Pete, and myself about next steps for moving forward. And then we'll open it up to you all to have a discussion about the project. So the overall goal of this regional coastal resilience project that SMPDC is leading is really to advance coastal resilience action in southern Maine through the development of a regional resilience plan. The purpose of that plan is to address regional resilience planning needs through coordinated conservation efforts, land use planning, and transferable adaptation policies and practices that really focus on nature-based solutions to coastal hazard impacts. And we'll talk more about what all of this means as we move through this morning's workshop. So just to provide a brief overview about what the project actually is, it's a 2-year project, again, to develop a regional coastal resilience plan, and it's funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation through their National Coastal Resilience Fund. It started in the spring of 2021, and it's slated to be complete in spring of 2023. It's being led by the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission, again, with support from the Wells Reserve, Maine Sea Grant, and then we also have land trusts, regional conservation organizations, state and federal natural resource entities, and the 10 coastal municipalities from Scarborough south to Kittery involved in the project. And the purpose of this is really to support local and regional resilience to coastal hazards, and to continue and advance the wonderful partnerships that already exist, and to leverage those partnerships to continue work in the regional planning field for coastal resilience. The idea of the project is also to make sure that we are coordinating on common priorities for coastal hazards and resilience, and also to leverage existing data, resources, and tools so that we can make sure that we are using the best available information to plan for coastal hazards and make sure that we are increasing the resilience of our region as a whole. We're also hoping to identify vulnerable areas in the region. And when we talk about vulnerable, we're talking about natural resources, infrastructure, social and economic components of the region, and the vulnerability of those things to coastal hazards. We are hoping to develop, based on that information, a priority list of regional needs for coastal resilience planning, and then use that information to develop strategic and locally tailored projects and strategies for advancing resilience in the region and address a lot of the coastal hazards that we're facing. So the project, again, is a 2-year project, and this is just a rough timeline of the major project tasks that will be accomplished. I will go into each of these tasks and what they entail in a little more detail coming up, but just to give you an idea of the overall timeline of the project. The first phase is really doing an assessment of what the needs are in the region for coastal resilience planning, and also to get a better idea about what the socioeconomic conditions in the region are and how that information relates to coastal resilience planning. Then we're going to use that information as well as other habitat, hazard, and natural environment data and resources to conduct an assessment of coastal vulnerabilities to coastal hazards to better understand what the impacts are. And then throughout the course of the project, we're really focused on stakeholder engagement. So this is the first working group workshop for the project, and we've also opened it up to a broader stakeholder group to make sure that we are getting information from you all about what you want to see out of this project and what you would like to see included in the Coastal Regional Resilience Plan. The fourth step is to identify and prioritize resilience strategies and projects for the region based on what the vulnerability assessment tells us, and then to compile all of that information into a regional resilience plan that can really help the region move forward with actual on-the-ground projects, further studies, and implementation. So digging into each task of the project in a little more detail, the first being the assessment of the regional resilience needs and socioeconomic conditions. Over the course of the summer, the project team completed a round of interviews and surveys with stakeholders to better understand what the needs really are for regional resilience planning. We've also been compiling and assessing geospatial data about social, demographic, and economic conditions in the region so that we can make sure that our resilience planning is focused not only on coastal hazards and impacts to infrastructure and the natural environment, but also accounts for social considerations and equity factors in the region. So there are a number of tools and resources at the federal level that we're going to be tapping into to get at the social vulnerability piece. Today's workshop won't highlight those resources and tools, but just know that those are being investigated and will be used in partnership with some of the resources and data about habitat, coastal hazards, and natural resource information. The project will also be engaging an environmental economist to help us with an analysis of socioeconomic information and identification of key considerations of economic information as well as social information that we can use to apply, again, an equity and social vulnerability lens to this project. And that information will be incorporated in an evaluation and prioritization criteria for the regional resilience projects that are developed as a result of this project. The second major project task is the vulnerability assessment to coastal impacts. So we'll be working with a GIS consultant to undertake an assessment of different coastal hazards. So looking at things like storm surge, sea level rise, marsh migration, and a number of other hazards and impacts that we can expect to experience in the region. And this portion will also build off of a number of existing regional efforts that have recently been undertaken to examine vulnerability of our coastal areas to natural hazards. So this will really involve pulling together existing data and resources to get a better picture of the comprehensive landscape of what coastal vulnerabilities, hazards, and impacts are in the area. So we'll be utilizing information about, again, sea level rise, storm surge, coastal erosion, overlaying that geospatial data with information about transportation infrastructure, land use data, looking at the location of critical infrastructure and facilities, also wildlife and habitat data, and then pulling in that demographic and economic information developed through task 1 to get a comprehensive picture of coastal vulnerability. So again, not just looking at one particular area or topic, but really trying to focus on a more holistic approach to examining coastal hazard impacts and regional vulnerability. And this information will serve as the basis for the identification and prioritization of vulnerable areas to inform development of resilience projects and strategies. Task 3 is stakeholder engagement and the establishment of a regional resilience working group. So for folks on this workshop who received a direct invitation from me to serve on the working group, that's what this was for. We've also opened this workshop up again to a broader stakeholder group to make sure that we're hearing from a range of stakeholders about what they want to see from this project. So the working group will help to guide the project throughout the course of the 2-year project and help us assess priority and focus areas, identify regional resilience needs, and then collaboratively develop criteria for prioritizing vulnerable areas and necessary projects. We'll also be doing a number of stakeholder engagement types to try to engage folks throughout the project and also make sure that we're moving together as a region with resilience planning. We also have an interactive web-based platform for the project that is going to be rolled out soon. So we will be able to share project information with everyone and also solicit feedback and input from stakeholders about, again, regional resilience needs and what the hopes are for this project. Task 4 is to identify and prioritize regional resilience strategies and projects. So we'll be using the information gathered through the vulnerability assessment and the socioeconomic assessment to develop a range of strategies that are focused on nature-based solutions for addressing coastal hazards. And we'll be engaging a coastal engineering consultant for that phase of the project to help us develop and visualize and better understand what the strategies and solutions could be. And then task 5 is really to roll all of that information together into a regional coastal resilience plan. And that will take the shape of a hard copy plan and also an interactive web-based story map that integrates some of the geospatial information that gets developed through the assessments, as well as the identification and prioritization of projects. The emphasis will really be on projects that align with funding opportunities, both through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, as well as other state and national funding programs. And the plan will also focus heavily on implementation of projects for enhancing regional resilience. So this is all being done, this whole project, in the context of some new planning guidance and information that has come out at the state level. So previously, there hasn't been a lot of state directive on coastal hazards and what communities should plan for. But with the Maine Climate Council and the release of the 4-year climate action plan, we have a lot of information that we can utilize to help guide this project. So we have some sea level rise planning guidance that we can tap into that's been developed through the Climate Council process. And then we're also focused on how we can shape this project to align with some of the goals and the strategies identified in the 4-year state climate action plan. So there's going to be a lot of synergy and overlap with this project, as well as some of the goals, including increased conserved land, emphasize resilience through land use planning and legal tools, and also implementing design standards for resilience in infrastructure projects. So shifting a little bit, I mentioned that there was some preliminary survey and interview work that was completed in the first phase of this project over the course of the summer. So I'm going to provide a bit of overview about what we heard initially from stakeholders in the region. So we asked folks what the top concerns were for coastal hazards. And you can see from this graph that people were pretty concerned about all of the coastal hazards we know that we're facing. So flooding, sea level rise, storm surge, coastal erosion, shoreline change, and increased precipitation. They're all of significant concern to stakeholders in the region. And then digging into concern about impacts on the natural environment, we can see that invasive species, loss of species, habitat loss, and coastal and beach erosion were also of major concern for stakeholders in the region. So we'll be utilizing this information in the vulnerability assessment to help guide some of the information that we focus on, so that the vulnerability assessment is getting at the top concerns of folks in the region. And then again, level of concern about coastal hazard impacts on the built and social environment. We can see that transportation and emergency access were top concerns, as well as impacts to property and coastal access. So this is all information, again, that will help us develop a vulnerability assessment that best meets the needs of everyone in the region. And then we also have some geospatial information that we've been gathering about areas that are of concern and areas that are already experiencing impacts. So Annie, do you want to go ahead and launch the first poll question? Okay, so this is a poll question about the survey responses that we heard. So we're wondering what you think the greatest identified need for building community resilience was. So go ahead and provide your thoughts through the poll. Okay, so it looks like people are still completing the poll, but there's local funding for resilience initiatives seems to be winning out. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Oh. Or maybe Annie, you might have to do that actually. Okay, so the top question, or the top response rather, sorry, was actually guidance documents and resources. And this workshop, as you might have noticed, is focused really on data, maps, resources, and tools that exist about hazards, impacts, and wildlife and habitat information. So why are we focusing this workshop on something that ranked relatively low, as a need for regional resilience planning? And the answer is that in order to develop guidance documents and resources and pursue state and federal funding, we need to have a better idea about what the actual impacts are in our region and what the local vulnerability is. So we need to gather information about hazards and impacts in order to develop the guidance documents and resources. So we'll be hearing from state partners and technical experts later in this workshop about some of those resources that we can utilize to develop the guidance for regional resilience planning. We're also hoping that starting out with a focus on what information exists already and what resources exist for Maine to support regional resilience planning will provide a common understanding and knowledge level for the working group and the project team, so that we're all operating from a common knowledge base and the same foundational information as we move forward with the project. Annie, you want to launch the next poll question? Okay, and this is also about the survey results, asking what respondents wanted to see the most of over the next 10 to 30 years in southern Maine in terms of resilience planning. So the responses are still coming in. It looks like development directed away from at-risk areas is the top choice for folks. Right. So we'll take a look at what the responses actually were, which is development directed away from at-risk area. So we can see that people really want to guide new and redevelopment away from areas that are vulnerable to coastal hazards, but there's also a strong interest in seeing additional conservation and restoration of natural areas and nature-based solutions, which are all great because that's what this project is really about. So we'll be using the results of the surveys and interviews and future engagement work to guide the project and to inform topics and strategies that we focus on, and also linking this project with other efforts to continue and build momentum for coastal resilience efforts in the region. So that stakeholder engagement, again, will look like continuation of the project working group, having workshops over the course of the project to guide the vulnerability assessment and also interpret the results and develop priority projects. And we'll be conducting additional surveys and interviews with folks throughout the project to get at some of that key stakeholder information. And again, have an interactive website where people can come to learn about the project and also provide feedback on what they'd like to see out of the regional resilience plan. We also, again, have an advisory committee made up of technical experts that's going to help guide some of the technical components of this project. So with that, I think we will start hearing from some of our partners and technical experts about federal and state level tools that exist that can help support this project and regional coastal resilience planning in general. So I will turn it over to Danny Boudreau from the NOAA Office for Coastal Management to talk a bit about the NOAA Digital Coast.
Okay, thank you so much, Abbie. Welcome, everybody. As Abbie mentioned, I'm Danny Boudreau from NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, and became connected with Abbie and this project because our office is a primary partner and funder alongside the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation behind the Coastal Resilience Grant that is funding the effort Abbie just described. So given our office's investment in the success of this project, we've been talking with Abbie and Annie to identify ways in which our office can further support this effort and the communities that they are working with. And one way that we have identified how we can best support them is through the diving into the Digital Coast training, which we are having now, and specifically thinking a little bit about how the resources on the Digital Coast can provide trainings and technical assistance to these communities. So next slide. All right, so just real quick, this is your Northeast team from the Office for Coastal Management. There are more people actually on the team, but this is the only folks we could fit on the slide. But today I'll be talking to you as the Northeast Regional Learning Services Coordinator, and then my colleague Jamie Carter as the Northeast Regional Geospatial Coordinator will talk a little bit more in depth about tools shortly. Next slide. So the Digital Coast, what is the Digital Coast? So the Digital Coast is what we like to call an enabling platform, which I'm sure all of you are now thinking, what is an enabling platform? So next slide. So an enabling platform is what we use to connect data to action. So we provide guidance, we provide learning resources, really to ensure that everything that is available to you on the Digital Coast is usable and that you can actually apply it in your daily jobs and the decisions that you have to make about coastal resources. Next slide. So there is a lot on the Digital Coast, and I'm not going to spend time covering it all because you would be completely overwhelmed. So Jamie and I are going to highlight just kind of a few things that we think might help this project given where you are at in assessing vulnerabilities. And so on the Digital Coast, we have data and tools. Next slide. And there are numerous tools. We have over almost 3,000 actually data sets available on the Digital Coast. And in terms of tools, we have about 70 decision support and visualization tools. And now many of these are created by our office, NOAA, but we don't actually create them all, as a big part of this part of the Digital Coast is partnerships. And so we actually have a Digital Coast partnership that includes numerous agencies, the Nature Conservancy, the the Planning Association. There's a long list of partners that vet and help us curate the resources that go up onto the digital coast. And then there's also agencies that we partner with to help meet emerging needs. And so here's an example of just some new tools that have actually just been added to the digital coast. We have the Neighborhoods at Risk tool, the EPA's Environmental Justice Screening Tool, and then USGS's Flood Event Viewer. And Jamie will touch on a few of these later on, but just wanted to kind of let you all know that the Digital Coast is being constantly updated as new needs are identified by our communities and by our partners. Next slide. In addition to data and tools, we have what is known as the Digital Coast Academy, and this is where a lot of our trainings are. Annie Cox, who opened up today, she is with the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve System and works for the Coastal Training Program. And we partner very closely with the Coastal Training Program at our reserves across the nation to help bring trainings, in addition to offering some of our own trainings through the Office for Coastal Management. Next slide. We have instructor-led trainings, both virtual and in person, and those take on obviously very different formats, as I think we've seen in the pandemic, that virtual trainings tend to be a little bit shorter and help and focus in on a little bit more specific targeted information. And then in person, we have trainings that run typically anywhere from 1 to 2 days. Next slide. And then in addition to our instructor-led trainings, we also have on-demand resources. And so this can be self-guided resources, case studies, quick references. We have videos and webinars. And that's for not only to support our instructor-led training, but also if you find that you are needing help learning something that's critical to your job and you just need it immediately, you can go here and get the information just by clicking on what resource you're looking for. Next slide. And then also we have topics and stories. So for our stories, next slide, we highlight a bunch of case studies. We have almost 100 case studies from across the nation that are up on our website. Here's one from Maine, actually one of our speakers, Pete, who modeled shoreline suitability for nature-based infrastructure. And so we put up on our website all the case studies and lessons learned to help transfer approaches between our partners. Next slide. All right, and finally we have topics. So if you go to the Digital Coast and you're just trying to figure out you know, what resources are available, what data, tools, trainings are available for a specific topic, you can go there and click on that topic and it will list everything that's available across everything that I've just mentioned, not so that you can kind of see what quick references are available, what data is available just by the click of a button. So you can see here we have adaptation strategies, coastal and economy. There's, I think, 12 topics in total. And so next slide. And today we are going to focus in on resilience planning and the tools, data, and trainings that are available for resilience planning. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague here, Jamie, who's going to focus in on some specific tools that can kind of help you in the phase that you are in, which is the explore local changing conditions and the assessing vulnerability. Keep in mind that we have tools and trainings that are available for all of these stages of resilience planning, but given our limited time with you, we just wanted to make sure that we focused in on the specific resources that were most relevant to what work you will be doing in the coming months. So Jamie, I hand it off to you.
Thank you, Danny. Great intro to Digital Coast, and now I'm going to focus in a little bit more on some of the geospatial resources that we have to offer for communities to help understand coastal flood risk. And first, I just want to again, try to set the stage, somewhat of a framework here to present the range of information. We really cater to folks who have all levels of geospatial experience. And a lot of the products we develop and deliver you know, through our shop and with partners are to help enable the use of geospatial information for policy and decision making. Of course, a lot of those products need to be created at the local level. And so we try our utmost to make sure that the data, the authoritative data behind the tools that a federal agency or a state agency might be developing are also available for people at, at the local level. So this schematic essentially describes the suite of training and tools and data that can support a lot of the coastal flood risk analysis and assessment that we try to support. There are two tools here that are highlighted, the sea level rise viewer and the coastal flood exposure mapper. And I'm going to be focusing on the coastal flood exposure mapper today, which is, you'll see it's further towards the right end of the continuum there. It's a streamlined screening tool that we've developed to really help communities access a larger portion of the flood risk information and data that are out there to more easily understand some of the local situations related to flood risk. So in a nutshell, the coastal flood exposure mapper provides access to maps. And the maps contain layers that illustrate coastal flood risks and hazards and vulnerabilities. So we include information about people, places, and natural resources. And it's also set up in a way that the maps can be exported directly from the viewer and used to help community conversations around resilience and coastal flood risk. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of a demonstration of the tool as well. Before I do that, I just want to summarize what we have in the viewer. Now, clearly we don't have everything, but these layers were pulled together, well, back after Hurricane Sandy hit New York and New Jersey. We developed this viewer and pulled these layers in based on feedback from the communities themselves, so that we could not only represent historic flooding events, but also what's happening currently through high tide flooding. And also what might be occurring in the future. So we incorporated some sea level rise scenario information and some storm surge scenario information. And you can see all of that can be overlaid on top of a variety of societal and infrastructure and ecosystem layers. Now, let's see if this works. Live demonstrations on stormy days are never a good idea, but I'm going to give it a shot. So I'm going right into the digital coast itself, and Danny gave you a quick orientation to the website. I'm on the tools page. Hopefully you can see my cursor up here. And as she mentioned, we have over 70 tools here. And just to make our job a little easier, we can use these filters on the far left. And I'm just going to click coastal hazards because that seems to be a pretty relevant topic for our discussion today. And that limits us to about 37 tools. If you start scanning down through here, you get a pretty good sense of what they might be describing. Here's our coastal flood exposure mapper. I'll go into detail on that. Here's the coastal resilience mapping portal that the Nature Conservancy, Jeremy Bell is going to be talking about in a little bit. Danny mentioned the environmental justice screening tool. That's here as well. The flood event viewer is a great resource. The towns of York and Scarborough actually used some data from this viewer to conduct a high watermark initiative project in both of those communities, highlighting prior flood events from 1978 and 2018. So that's a nice resource to look at. Continue scrolling down. The NOAA Tides and Currents Inundation Dashboard it's a wonderful resource. I'm going to flip to that briefly because I check in on this all the time, especially on days like today when we have some significant storm activity happening out there. And I just wanted to draw your attention to what's happening currently. If I look at the Portland tide gauge, it currently is running about 2 feet above the predicted tide. So it's essentially a 2-foot storm surge we're experiencing right now. And I'm going to use that number here in just a minute when we start exploring the flood exposure mapper. But keep in mind that you can look at a variety of locations throughout the country, and I'm just kind of focusing on the Northeast right now, obviously. And then just to wrap up the quick tour through the Digital Coast Tools section, down on the bottom is our sea level rise viewer, as well as some additional analytical tools provided by the Corps and NOAA to help us understand future sea level rise. Okay, so now if I was to go back up to the coastal flood exposure mapper, and launch this, we get to a splash page, which before I actually launched the tool, I wanted to take you down to the bottom because this is really the power of the digital coast. This is where we connect the tool that we're currently looking at with the data, the stories, other tools, and training that are all topically relevant. So if, for instance, you're interested in pulling those data layers into your own GIS system, here is access to those layers. If you're interested in understanding how other communities have used the tool, here are some stories that describe that process. Here are a variety of other tools that are related in some aspect, and then some trainings. And we have a lot of different trainings related to coastal resilience, as Danny mentioned. So a great resource where it's all connected right here. Okay, now it's time to launch the viewer, and I'm just going to give you a quick tour because I've got just a few minutes left. This is the splash screen. You can see it's a nationally available tool at this point, although it started right there in New York post-Sandy. We expanded the mapping and the analytical processes to make it relevant most everywhere. And so I'm just going to zoom into an area here that you're likely familiar with. And just because I know York, and Abbie had a nice slide of the Wiggly Bridge earlier, let's just focus in on this area. And so what you see is a variety of colors, and I'll just pop up the legends so we can understand what we're looking at. And this map essentially is a composite of all the historic, current, and potential future flood risks that we've mapped with our partners. And so the more hazards that exist at a specific point, the darker the color. And you can click it anywhere on this map and get a quick list of what the different hazards are at that location. So I just clicked an area down in York, and we can see that we are in a FEMA 1% annual chance flood zone, as well as the 500-year flood zone. We know this area probably experiences high tide flooding. So when we hit high tide today, it's likely we're going to see a little bit of flooding in this location. We know this area is susceptible to sea level rise. And if we get a Category 1 hurricane up here, we might actually see some flooding related to that event as well. So it's a nice way to look at not only just the coastal areas, but some of the inland areas, because we do have that FEMA flood layer. Now, the composite is useful, but there are, like I said before, a lot of other layers included. So we can look at storm surge. We can look at FEMA flood zones, and this kind of breaks it down by the different flood zone itself. And we can look at sea level rise. So I mentioned earlier that we're experiencing about a 2-foot surge today. And if we wanted to see what that looks like on the map, 2 feet above mean high water essentially inundates these sorts of areas. And you can see very quickly how those are highlighted on the map. And if you want to understand what's being impacted, well, then you can start turning on some of the the impacted layers, the societal exposure, the infrastructure exposure, and ecosystem exposure. So we've extracted some development information from our land cover mapping program. It's fairly coarse resolution, but it highlights those areas that are currently developed. And then you can start to overlay some of those coastal hazard risks to see how they relate to our developed areas. Now, the final thing I'll say before I hand it back over to Annie is these maps can all be saved. So I can click on the save map icon down below, and that's going to save it to my maps. And looks like the internet is a little bit slow right now, not surprising. But when that finishes saving, it'll be in my library, which I can then download as a static graphic or share out with members in the community via email or some social media. And so that's a really nice feature of the tool. It was designed so that these maps could be pulled off the web and made available to the community outside of the kind of the internet realm. So hopefully that helps alleviate some of the stresses associated with working with digital maps. And I think I'm going to just wrap it up there, Annie, and hand it over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Danny, for the great overviews about some of the NOAA digital coast tools. We are going to turn it over to Pete Slovinsky now from the Maine Geological Survey and sort of switch gears from the national level tools to state-specific resources. And while Pete is pulling up his presentation, we'll go ahead and do another poll. What is the largest storm surge rounded to the nearest foot that has been recorded along the Maine coastline since record keeping began in 1912? So the options are 5 feet, 3 feet, 1 foot, 10 feet, or 8 feet. So go ahead and enter what you think the largest storm surge has been along the Maine coastline. Give it a few more seconds here. It looks like people think 8 feet. And then 5 feet and 10 feet look like they have the same amount of votes. So the correct answer is actually 5 feet. And Pete will be talking a bit about that in his presentation. So Pete, take it away.
Hey, thank you, Abbie. Hi, everyone. Pete Slovinsky with the Maine Geological Survey. I'm going to spend a couple minutes just talking with you about the latest trends that we're seeing around sea level rise, where it's going, what the state has adopted in terms of guidance, and then finish to build off of what Jamie spoke about with some state data sets which could be used to help drive local decision making. So a couple graphs to start. This is a long-term tide gauge data from NOAA for Portland, goes back to 1912 through data through September of 2021. So each blue dot is the averaged annual sea level, and the 0 line here is the long-term average. So anything above that line is above the long-term average, anything below it is below it. So you can see since about 1912 we've been rising, and the rate has been about 7.5 inches per century, which meets global changes that are being observed over about the last 100 years. And over the short term, roughly the last 30 years or so, since satellite data on an international level has been developed and is capturing sea level, changes have been at about 3.2 millimeters per year. And locally, in the Portland tide gauge data, we're actually seeing about the same change, about 3.2 millimeters per year. So almost 13 inches per century. So not quite a doubling of the long-term rate, but coming pretty close. The interesting thing here is that about half of the observed sea level, that long-term average again is about halfway point, has occurred since about 1990. So how have we been trending in 2021? Jamie mentioned NOAA co-ops. I visit that page probably daily because I'm a geek, but I like to keep track of how sea levels have been trending for each month. So each month we actually do an average of the sea levels, and you can see here that basically January, February, April, July, August, and September, we've been in the top 10 of the monthly sea levels since going back to 1912. So we're continuing to trend high. So just a couple more graphs of where things might go in the future. This is a graph that we developed as part of the Maine Won't Wait Scientific Technical Subcommittee, which was tasked with coming up with the scenarios that the state of Maine should consider. And this takes long-term tide gauge data, which I already shared. That's that blue line down at the bottom here, through 2021. And then we look at a bunch of regionalized scenarios, which were developed using a curve calculator from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which uses national data from the National Climate Assessment in terms of sea level rise scenarios. And what we did here is we plotted what's called the low, intermediate, all the way to the high. And the state has decided that we should be planning for an intermediate scenario out to the year 2100, which is this red line, which basically the range of potential sea level rise around that is 3 to 5 feet with a central estimate of 4 feet. We also plot the intermediate high and the high scenario, and I'll talk about why we included the high scenario, which is roughly 8.8 feet. Basically, it comes out to the fact that if we have even the intermediate amount of sea level rise, we should consider looking at that high scenario because we're going to continue to have storm surges of around 5 feet on top of any sea level that we do get. So in a kind of a tabular format, the way of looking at this is for the commit to manage, and that's the language that we used, which is let's update all of our regulations to use these scenarios as opposed to the old scenarios, which is basically 2 feet by the year 2100. What this says is by the year 2050, we should be considering 1.5 feet, and by 2100, 4 feet. And the prepare to manage, again, is when we're doing an alternatives analysis or we're thinking about critical infrastructure, which is going to be in place for the next 100, 150 years, take a look at 3 feet by the year 2050 and potentially 9 feet by the year 2100. But it's the commit to manage, which is going to be kind of adopted in regulation. So of course, sea level is the thing that's occurring in the background, and we generally consider it to be something that happens over a longer period of time. But it's storm surges like we're seeing today of around 2 feet that are of concern to the communities, and storm tides. And the difference between those two is pretty simple. If you have a predicted tide of 10 feet, like in this image, and a storm comes in and you measure 14 feet as the overall water level that's observed, that's your storm tide of 14 feet. It's the combination of your predicted tide and your storm surge. Well, the difference between those two is what we call storm surge, and it's just what's caused by basically the wind blowing onshore and waves. Now, I had a whole bunch of other graphs and tables and stuff, but I think it's much easier to just kind of summarize this in text in terms of what we see along the Maine coastline. Basically every year, so there's a 100% chance. When I say there's a 1-year recurrence interval, that means there's a 100% chance in any year that southern Maine is going to see a 2-foot storm surge, just like we're seeing today. Now, about every 10 years, or you could call it a 10-year recurrence interval, or a 10% chance of occurring in any given year, we see about a 3 to 3.5 foot surge. So pretty significantly higher. And about once every 100 years, or a 1% chance of every given year, we have between a 4.5 and 5 foot surge. And this is for the whole Maine coastline, from Kittery basically all the way down east. The statistics are relatively consistent amongst the tide gauges. Now, storm tides are different because, of course, your predicted tides go up as you go up the Maine coast. So I'm not going to be giving you the actual numbers associated with what those elevations reach. But the key thing that we noted in looking at the data is there's only about a 1 foot difference, that's not 1.5 feet at some of the tide gauges, between a 1 in a 10-year event and a 10 in a 100-year event. Okay, so what that means is with 1 foot of sea level rise, the 10-year event will have the impact of a 100-year storm, or conversely, the recurrence interval will change so that the 10-year event will be at a 100-year, or the 100-year event will be at a 10-year recurrence interval. So the other thing I wanted to posit to you, not even thinking about sea level rise, is what could our worst storm look like? And historically, our worst storm has been what's called the blizzard of 1978. It hit in February of 1978 and caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage throughout New England. And this was a storm where we had about an 11.3 foot tide and only a 20% surge, so less than 3 feet of surge. But it hit at super high tide, not relatively high tide, so that the combined water level is the highest recorded since 1912. It was 14.1 feet above mean low or low water. So I asked myself, well, what would be southern Maine's superstorm be? Well, it would be a king tide. So that's 12 feet as opposed to 11.3. And you'd be seeing that record surge, which in Portland is 4.7 feet. So you'd be seeing water levels that are about 3 feet higher than what occurred in the 1978 storm. This is not even accounting for sea level rise. This is just what could happen if we married a high tide with our maximum surge. The other thing to think about from a sea level rise and flooding standpoint is what we call nuisance flooding. And that's, you can't drive through an area, you got to walk around the puddles that form. But we're noting that the amount of nuisance flooding is increasing in both frequency and duration. So if we went back and looked at 1912 to 2020, on average, Portland would exceed flood stage around 4 hours per year. And over roughly the last decade, we're noting that that's between 3 and 4 times more common. So we're up to about 13.5 hours per year. So what you see right here, is a nuisance, but it's becoming more and more frequent. So I asked myself, what would this look like if we added 1 foot of sea level rise? And the numbers are actually pretty staggering. There is between a 10 and 15-fold increase in nuisance flooding with just 1 foot of sea level rise. So what was 14 hours a year becomes 140 hours a year if we're looking at the last decade of data. And that might become more than just a nuisance when you think about it. So in terms of sea level rise summaries, we do have a long-term trend that's increasing, but about half of what's occurred since 1912 occurred since the early 1990s, actually. Short-term sea level rises can occur. I didn't really get into that, but one of the keys in terms of low amounts of sea level rise is that we see a 10 to 15-fold increase in nuisance flooding. A 10-year event would have the impact of a 100-year event. And from a management standpoint, we recommend it's actually now going to be in state law, but Committing to manage for a higher probability, lower risk scenario, and that's that intermediate scenario of 1.5 feet by 2050 and 4 feet by the year 2100, but considering to prepare to manage for that lower probability, higher risk scenario, and we've adopted that high scenario of 3 feet by 2050 and 9 feet roughly by 2100. We're going to be revisiting these numbers every 4 years as national data comes out associated with the National Climate Assessment. And one of the key points is in 2100, we don't expect sea level to just stop rising. So we need to think actually beyond 2100 when we start thinking about, the next 100 years. It used to be 2100 was 100 years from the year 2000. So I want to finish for the last 5 minutes or so that I have talking about some online tools that we've created to supplement what Jamie already shared with you. First is our sea level rise viewer. It's similar to what Jamie showed. It just starts at the highest astronomical tide, which is that king tide basically, and then adds various sea level rise scenarios on top of it. And you can go in and click under the layers button here and turn different layers off. Here I've just turned on the 3.9 foot layer on top of the highest astronomical tide. This is showing an area of Moody Beach going up into Wells. This is Casino Point right here, and the Webhan River right here. So you can see what would be inundated under those scenarios. We also have put out something called the sea level rise ticker. This is the way that we're keeping track of short-term sea level rise trends since 1993 at all 5 of Maine's tide gauges. So you can see the short-term trend for Portland. We've highlighted it here. And then it also shows what the last month of available data, for in this case it's September, how it ranks in terms of all of September's water levels that have been recorded. And it just so happened that in September 2020 was the 3rd highest September ever recorded since 1912 in Portland. And then you can see here, you can click on this Maine Sea Level Rise dashboard to learn more. You can see a bunch of fancy graphs that show on the left-hand side. This is the black line is showing how the water levels have trended in Portland in 2021 in relation to the highest recorded water levels. That's the red line you see here. The long-term average, so think of that as kind of the mean, and then the lowest water levels at Portland for each of the months. You can also see the short-term and long-term sea level rise trends. And then you can see kind of king tide flooding, the frequency of that over the last, going back to 1912 with the long-term average in the black line, and how these numbers would change if you added just 0.8 or 1.5 feet of sea level rise. The numbers when you add 3 or 4 feet or 5 feet or 9 feet of sea level rise just are astronomical, and you really don't even want to look at those. So that we just add that 1.5, but using that 2050 as our timeline. The Governor's Office for Policy and Innovation for the Future have put together this great viewer, which is similar to a graph I showed, showing the long-term trend in Portland and how it relates to both the intermediate and high curves. And you can pick mid-century or end of century, and then click somewhere along this curve, and it gives you the predicted values of sea level rise for the central estimates based on those intermediate and high curves for each of the tide gauges. So pretty interesting, because you could pick a time period, say out in 2070 or 2030 or 2040 to get a sense of what the sea level rise scenarios would be. We also run something called the Maine Beach Mapping Program. We use a very precise GPS to monitor 2 different features at southern Maine beaches in York, Cumberland, and Saginaw counties. It's basically the mean high water contour along the beach. We also monitor the dune edge, and between those 2 you can calculate the dry beach width, it's called. And this is an example of Pine Point. You can click on any of these transects when you go to this website, and it gives you information on what the linear regression rate, or basically what's the foot per year change rate at that transect. So they're all color coded so that greens are positive, yellows are slightly negative, and oranges and reds are very negative. And these are the key numbers to look at, the linear regression rate. There's a bunch of other statistics in there you can dig at if you read at the help file. But this is for dune change, beach change we also do. You can see that the changes are slightly different. Change in dry beach width from the previous year. So how has that dry beach width changed from 2020 to 2021? And also the mean dry beach width, which is the average dry beach width for all the years that we have data at that location. We've also developed something called the Coastal Structure and Dune Crest Inventory and Overtopping Potential Tool. The acronym is really long, so I'm not going to try to say it, so I'll just spell that out. And the idea here is we've mapped all of the approximate maximum dune crests using LiDAR data. That's the green lines you see here. We've also mapped all of the visible structures that we can see. So you can see all the bulkheads along the backside of the Webhanet River. You can see along the jetty here. And if you clicked on one of those, which this isn't live, you get information about what the seaward habitat type is and what the structure is. For instance, if you clicked back in here, you'd see that this is a bulkhead with a marsh behind it or a mudflat behind it. And if you zoom in or click on different layers in here, you get an idea of how the maximum elevation of either the dune or the structure relates to the FEMA preliminary flood hazard zones and the base flood elevations associated with those. As you can see here, again, it's color-coded green to red, with reds being below base flood elevation, yellows being around it, and greens being above it. And then you can click on a section and it tells you what the flood zone elevation type is, what the static base flood elevation is, and what the maximum dune elevation is at that location, and then the comparison between those two. So it's a tool to kind of give you a sense of, you know, how do things relate in terms of our natural and built protective structures, how do they relate to these flood zones? So that's all I had for you. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Abbie and Annie. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Pete, for that great presentation about a slew of Maine resources that are available to support understanding coastal hazards and planning for resilience. So we are now going to hear from Jeremy Gabrielson from the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. And if folks have questions throughout these presentations, feel free to add them to the chat. Otherwise, we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this section for people to post questions. So Jeremy, let me pull up your presentation here and you can take it from there.
Great, thanks, Abbie. I'm Jeremy Gabrielson. I'm the conservation planner with Maine Coast Heritage Trust. We're a land trust that works statewide, primarily in coastal Maine. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about land conservation as it relates to resilience and marsh migration. So next slide, Abbie. So we're primarily talking about coastal risks today, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention this resilient land mapping tool that was developed by the Nature Conservancy. And I just want to hit on this real quickly because the basic concepts here are similar to what we look at in coastal systems. So with regard to habitat resilience, what we're really looking at fundamentally is connectivity. It's the ability for species to move across the landscape. So as climate changes, species need to move across the landscape in order to find suitable places to live. That is true for plants, it's true for animals. And what this map does, essentially, this is now available for all of the continental United States, is it looks at every pixel in the United States and it asks, if a species were in that and it wanted to move to the next pixel over, is it likely to find a place that's like where it started or unlike where it started? And if it's likely to find a place that's similar to where it was, that's a measure of connectivity for species movement. I'll just point out in southern Maine, you can see Portland in the northeast corner of this map and the Portsmouth area in the center bottom. There are some areas where there's a lot of development that inhibits connectivity. But there's also some really dark green areas where there's a lot of landscape connectivity for terrestrial species. And this is really important because of the amount of biodiversity in southern Maine. There's a lot of species here that are at the northern edge of their range, and there's a lot more right behind them that are looking to move up through. With that, I'm going to shift and focus to connectivity as it relates to marshes. Next slide. So just as a really basic intro to salt marshes and marsh habitat, the next few graphics are all from a publication that was put out by the Northeast Regional Ocean Council called Make Way for Marshes, which is a great guide to marshes and marsh migration strategies. Essentially, salt marshes grow in an area between roughly the mean high water and the highest annual tide. They like to be inundated by the salt water periodically, but also have their feet dry, or at least drying for part of the day. So that's the area that we're looking at. And when we talk about marsh migration, what we're talking about is the sea level rising into that marsh upland boundary, and then having the plants that are growing in the salt marsh colonize those new areas as sea level rises. Next slide. One more piece on marshes and marsh ecology. It's important to understand that marshes can move in two directions. They can move up, so as the plants grow, they are capturing sediment. They're also growing and their roots expand and they form peat. They actually create their own soil and build that elevation over time. Up till now, marshes in southern Maine have been able to keep pace more or less with sea level rise. The question moving forward is, will they be able to continue to do so? Next slide. So if they can't do so, then in order for us to continue to have those salt marshes on the landscape, which provide habitat for a lot of important species, but also provide a lot of ecosystem services in terms of wave attenuation, flood control, water quality, and water filtration and water quality improvements for people. If they can't go up, if sea level rises too fast, then they have to move back. And the basic model for this is that if the land behind where the marsh is relatively flat, as the salt water moves in, it will kill back the freshwater vegetation, allowing the marsh to move inland. That can't happen in this slide if the land is too steep, or if there is development that blocks the marshes from moving back. Next slide. So the Maine Natural Areas Program a few years ago developed a model for looking at areas where marsh migration is likely to occur. This map is showing the area around the York River marshes, the headwaters of the York River. And in the map that you're looking at, you can see the yellow area is current salt marsh along the York River. And the red areas just adjacent to it are areas that are likely to become intertidal with 3 feet of sea level rise or 1 meter of sea level rise. One thing I'll point out with this map is all of the cross-hatched areas. Those are areas where there's development or that are impacted by development. And those are places where we're not looking, there's something there that people have built that they're likely going to take some action to defend. So when we're looking at priorities for marsh migration and for land protection, we're really looking at the other areas, the areas that are more natural, have a more natural land cover where those marshes can colonize new areas. And I'll just note, I don't have existing conserved land on this map, but there is a lot of conserved land, particularly on the northeastern side of this marsh, that's been protected both by York Land Trust, as well as some properties that are owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide, please. So lastly, I just wanted to share an example of how, as a land trust, we're using this data to inform both our project selection as well as how we can use it to inform design of conservation projects. The example I'm going to show is from Jones Marsh, which is on the head of Mount Desert Island. The cars that you can see in the background of this image are on Route 3 driving from the head of the island over toward Bar Harbor. And you can see in this image, there's salt marsh grasses on the left, and they butt right up against the dome peat bog on the right. So this is a place where there is low elevation and we expect marsh migration to occur. Next slide. A couple of years ago, we were approached by a landowner who owned this property that's outlined. And this is the same style map that we looked at a moment ago, where you can see the current marsh in yellow and the future marsh in red. The red is that domed peat bog that's sitting there at Jones Marsh. And this property, as you can see, includes both a significant portion of that marsh migration area as well as some undeveloped buffers. What's really nice about the data that are available from Maine Natural Areas Program and the Maine Geological Survey is they're at a fine enough scale where we can use them both to identify landowners that we would like to reach out to and talk about options for conserving their property, but they're also useful at a parcel level for us to make decisions that inform how we'd like to design conservation. Next slide, please. So in this shot, again, same color scheme. You can see the yellow is the current marsh, the red is that marsh migration area. And coming down from Route 3, the previous owner of this property had developed a road to create a subdivision, and that road actually sits right at 3 feet above sea level rise. Not an ideal place to locate development. Houses on the western side of that road would have experienced some serious flooding in the relatively near future. So when we purchased this parcel, though, one of the things that we noted is that to the right of that, there's a relatively steep gradient going up to that power line. And once you get up there, you're at an elevation of about 25 or 30 feet, and you're 200 or 300 feet back from the edge of the marsh. That's an area that's less critical for marsh migration. And we know that this is an area of Bar Harbor where there is a critical need for affordable housing in Bar Harbor and on MDI. And this is an area that where the town has prioritized locating more housing that would be affordable for workforce. Next slide. So what we were able to do is work with the Island Housing Trust, which works on Mount Desert Island, to develop affordable housing and partition this property. The parcel on the left, Maine Coast Heritage Trust now owns, and we manage as a preserve where we will allow that marsh migration to play out over time. The area on the right, which sits back from, not just from the current resource, but from the edge of what will be the future marsh, has been transferred to the Island Housing Trust, and they're currently working on a plan to develop affordable housing on that portion of the property, which is going to be less impacted by sea level rise. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'm just going to give you a preview of the viewer that the next Jeremy is going to talk about. This is the Nature Conservancy's future habitat viewer. And I just wanted to point this out because even though we work in GIS with these data a lot, this tool is really fantastic for a quick look at what's happening on a parcel level. I actually refer to this when I get a call from our project managers or a partner, just because it's so easy to pull up and quickly look at not only how much marsh is on a property now, but what's likely to be there in the future. So that's all I have.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Now we'll turn it over to Jeremy Bell from the Nature Conservancy.
Thanks, Abbie. And thanks, Jeremy, for the two good plugs for the tools that we've developed. So I'm going to be talking to you about the tool that you just saw that Jeremy showed you, and also some other online decision support tools that we developed to help planners and decision makers respond to the effects of climate change. If you could go to the next slide, please. So there are 3 tools. The one you just saw, the Future Habitat Explorer. There's also the Coastal Risk Explorer, which I'll show you. And then we have a third one called the Inland Flood Risk Explorer, which is in development right now. And it has to do with flooding and inland culverts, so on freshwater systems. Okay, next slide, please, Abbie. This is our landing page, and the site is on the TNC's global coastalresilience.org page. And so this is the URL, I think, is in the documents that Annie said was in the in the handouts for the workshop. And I'm proud to say that we've put a lot of effort into these tools, and last year we had over 3,000 individual users, distinct users, visit our pages here to look at these decision support tools. We've had every continent. Most people are from Maine that visit the tools, but we've had people from every continent but Antarctica take a look at our tool. So that's on my bucket list, to get somebody from Antarctica to come view our page. Oh, I lost the presentation. Is that okay, here we go. And so while that's coming back up, I want to give a shout out to MNAP, Natural Areas Program, and Maine Geological Survey for sharing data with us. And what I would say about our tools, it's different from some of the other tools that you've seen, and you've seen a lot today, is that the tools that we designed are meant to be used down to the parcel level and also the local road level, so that people can use the tools to make decisions on the ground. And so it's supposed to be, these are intentionally very fine scaled tools as opposed to landscape level analysis. So here's a shot, you already saw it, of the Future Habitat Explorer showing existing tidal marsh in dark green, and then at the 2-foot sea level rise scenario, the lighter colored areas where marshes would potentially migrate into the future. And then also the orange lines are the parcel maps, so that the smaller land trusts that don't have GIS capability can take a look at these sites easily and look at potential property acquisitions and know how much current and future tidal marsh is on the site. So next slide, please. Okay, and this is probably, I would say this is probably our marquee tool. It's turned out to be our marquee tool, which is the Coastal Risk Explorer. And so this uses the Maine Geological Survey sea level rise scenarios to predict road inundation. And you're looking obviously at Old Orchard Beach. So this is a screenshot from the tool itself. And so the red lines that you're seeing are roads that would be inundated with water at high tide at the 2-foot sea level rise scenario. You can see where the tides are coming in. And then what we've done with this tool is we've shown homes, addresses that are inaccessible because the roads are flooded, to emergency services. And so this is what we call a lifelines tool. Is so it's you know, if your home is on fire, or if you're having a medical emergency in this situation, the emergency services would not be able to get to your house. And what we've also done to further the conversation is to estimate a cost. So these numbers are townwide, that $9.6 million for Old Orchard Beach to upgrade their roads to get them essentially out of that 2-foot sea level rise scenario. And we developed this tool a few years ago. That number of the cost to upgrade the roads it's a rough number, but I think it starts a conversation about what it will take to respond to these sort of nuisance flood events, I guess is what they're called. I think they're more than a nuisance if your lifeline and your direct path to the hospital is interrupted by high tides flooding the roads. Okay, so next slide, please. And so the third tool, which like I said is in development right now, the data are done, and so there's the backend data available. And I should say there's backend data available for all these tools if you wanted to do a deeper dive than these sort of online, more communication and education support tools. But what the Inland Flood Risk Explorer is we have a database of over 30,000 culverts in the state of Maine that have been each hand measured by field crews over the last 13 years. And my colleague, Ben Matthews, who sadly just left the Nature Conservancy, what he did was he spent 2 years developing a flood model for each culvert, each of the 30,000 culverts. I just have to sort of emphasize that. It was a huge amount of work. And what he essentially did was he looked at the different flood levels for all these freshwater culverts and the flood risk associated with those. And so the more red the culvert, this is in Piscataquis County, but the more red the dot is, the higher the flood risk of the culvert. And then we've also paired that with fish passage data as well, so that we can combine the culverts with the biggest flood risk with also the most important fish passage concerns as well. And the reason why I show you this tool, I know this is largely a coastal workshop, but many coastal communities have inland culverts on them, and so there are flood risk culverts even in the most coastal of towns. And so I just wanted to make you aware that this data is, or this tool is in development, and the data is available to you for planning purposes. And so with that, I think I'll close out. Like I said, our tools are meant to be used at that very specific parcel and road level for planning purposes. There's the URL, and please feel free to reach out and contact me if you're interested in knowing more about the tools and how to use them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. We have another poll question up asking which aspect of sea level rise and coastal storms are you most concerned about? So go ahead and pop your responses into that poll, and that will help to inform not only the Regional Coastal Resilience Project, but I think some future updates that the Nature Conservancy might have planned for their wonderful tools that Jeremy just presented. So while folks are doing that, we can transition to the next speaker, Jake from the Wells Reserve.
Thank you, Abbie. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. My name is Jake Aman. I'm the Stewardship Director at the Wells Reserve. And today I'll be speaking to you about the Maine Tidal Restriction Atlas, which was developed by the Maine Coastal Program in partnership with a number of the organizations that you've heard from today. Next slide, please. So the Atlas was created to be the most comprehensive database of tidal road crossings in the state of Maine. That's road crossings that are subject to some level of tidal influence. It could be a headwater stream that just sees even freshwater tidal influence, or it could be a crossing, a major bridge or other crossing that's closer to the ocean. The data set complements the upcoming release of the coast-wise approach for tidal road crossing design, which is being developed by Maine Coastal Program and partners. And those guidelines will be a great resource for municipalities that are looking to upgrade their coastal road infrastructure so that it can be more resilient to the changing conditions in the coast. And the tool, the Tidal Restriction Atlas, is really intended as a preliminary assessment tool, a desktop screening tool that can be used to identify priorities and then prompt further investigations in the field. Next slide, please. So the methods that Maine Coastal Program employed to develop this tool included strictly a desktop assessment, and they utilized a number of different existing data sets. They looked at historical data that was collected on Maine tidal crossings from a number of different projects, most prominently one that was known as Return the Tides, which was developed at a couple different points back in the 90s. And but this is the first effort really to compile all of that information into a digital online resource. I believe the Return the Tides database is actually mostly a paper binder. So this is really a great step forward for this data, and it's hopefully going to be a really useful tool moving forward. In addition to the locations of the tidal restrictions in relation to tidal flooding, or I should say the tidal crossings in relation to tidal flooding, Maine Coastal Program conducted a number of analyses to highlight the impacts of these crossings on coastal resources, including the likelihood that they present a restriction to tidal flow. So that's the road crossing does not have enough hydraulic capacity to allow the maximum tidal flooding to pass through the culvert to the upstream areas. And they used a variety of data to help identify these restrictions, including aerial and satellite imagery, photos and survey data that were collected as part of the Maine Road Stream Crossing survey, and charts and historical topo maps to help identify the historic extent of salt marsh habitat upstream. They also used 6 sea level rise scenarios that are included in the most recent National Climate Assessment, and that Pete Slovinsky spoke about earlier in the Maine Sea Level Rise Viewer. And The use of the sea level rise scenarios allowed the tool to include future crossings, crossings that will become tidal crossings in the future. So that's a really helpful tool when we're talking about infrastructure that has a design life potentially of 50 to maybe 100 years, depending on the structure. You want to know whether or not that crossing is going to be tidal in the future, because it's going to, you know, that tidal hydrology is going to significantly influence the performance of those structures. And finally, there was a number of ecological data that have also been included in this viewer, so that the user can be aware of additional impacts that may be resulting from that crossing. The marsh migration data that both Jeremy Gabrielson and Jeremy Bell mentioned earlier has been included, and this is actually really a really important feature of this tool, because as Jeremy mentioned, tidal marsh migration is contingent upon the ability of the marsh both to move landward, but also to receive adequate tidal flooding so that the natural functions of the salt marsh can take place. And tidal restrictions often inhibit those functions from occurring. And so knowing that a road crossing is a tidal restriction and that it may have upstream salt marsh is really important for planning for that coastal habitat resilience. And finally, all of the analysis, the GIS analysis that were done by Maine Coastal Program have been manually verified by painstakingly crawling through each data set and confirming that the analysis that was done was true, at least to the best of their ability for each of the crossings. Next slide, please. So ultimately, the database includes over 1,000 existing tidal crossings, or I should say tidal sites in the state of Maine, which include both road crossings, railroad crossings, tidal dams, and other structures. 90% of those existing tidal crossings are likely restrictions based on the GIS analysis that Maine Coastal Program went through. With up to 11 feet of sea level rise, approximately 700 additional crossings become tidal. And that's a pretty significant increase, and again, really important for the design horizon of those structures to understand that. As I mentioned, there's a number of different ecological data that have been included as attributes for this, this data. And that includes the occurrence of species of greatest conservation need as identified by the state, and beginning with habitat focus areas, and a number of other data that are important for planning. Finally, I want to point out that there's a number of data that are not included in the publicly available viewer that occur on private lands. And if users are interested in seeing that data and working with that data, if they're interested in having customized data sets for their region or area of interest, or if they'd like to see I think it's somewhere around 500 attributes that are included in all of the data sets that were compiled, please reach out to Maine Coastal Program and they can work with you to access that data. Next slide, please. So now we're going to just take a quick look at the viewer itself. Again, this is just a slide. This isn't a live viewer, but this is what you will see more or less when you log in. And in the legend here on the right-hand side, if you can read that tiny text, you'll notice that we have a variety of different symbols on the map representing both current and future tidal crossings. All of those layers can be turned on and off in the tools there on the bottom middle. There's a number of different widgets. This viewer is created, excuse me, in Esri's ArcGIS Online web app builder. So if you're familiar with ArcGIS Online, you'll be familiar with a lot of these tools. You can turn the legend on and off. You can turn a number of the layers on and off, including the supplementary layers like sea level rise and marsh migration that were included in the analysis. You can search by address. So if you're interested in a particular location, you can type that into the search bar at the top left. And then you can actually view the data table itself. There's a small button on the bottom right for opening up that table where you can view the attributes. Next slide, please. Once you're sort of zoomed into your area of interest, it becomes a little bit more user-friendly. You can click on individual points on the map and view the attributes for that location. There's a little very narrow slider bar that allows you to scroll up and down. There's quite a lot of attributes, including summary data about the crossing itself, structure data that was been compiled from both the Road Stream Crossing Survey and also the Maine DOT database, ecological data, and so on. Next slide, please. So here's just a shot of the data table being opened. And once you're in here, there's a filter function, so you can zero in on the particular crossings of interest or categories that you're interested in. I'll note that not the crossings are organized in multiple tables, depending on whether they're tidal road crossings, dams, or other, and whether they're future road crossings, dams, or other. So each of these tables includes a different subset of the data. And you can filter those data within those subsets. And then finally, there's an export tool. So you can actually take these data out of the viewer and export it to a spreadsheet that you can work with in other software. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, there's additional layers that can be turned on and off in the viewer, including some of the sea level rise layers that were mentioned earlier. So here we're looking at the high sea level rise or intermediate high sea level rise scenario in the Wells-Kennebunk region. This is really useful for just sort of unpacking the data a little bit and looking at why a site might be included as a future tidal restriction and under what scenario that would take place. And in addition to this, there's also a really great function where you can actually bring in online hosted data sets that are part of the Esri Living Atlas, as well as your own custom data sets that you may be interested in. I think I may even show that on the next slide, please, Abbie. Yep, so here we go, just looking at that add data tool. Here we can see some Maine-based data, Maine LiDAR, hillshade, or other ortho imagery or aerial imagery that you might like to overlay on the map to complement your analysis. Next slide, please. So next steps, the Tidal Restriction Atlas is not static. It's going to be updated over time as Maine Coastal Program identifies errors or obtains new data that complement the database. Maine Coastal Program and the Maine Coast Heritage Trust have developed a field survey protocol to help confirm the desktop analysis. And I believe 2021 was the first year that that was rolled out. So the coastal program will be updating the data to reflect the field confirmation that was done this year. Those surveys will be continuing as partner organizations are able to do so. And anybody that's interested in ground truthing the data in their community should reach out to Maine Coastal Program for that protocol. The coast-wise approach design guidelines that I mentioned earlier will be coming out soon. And just as a teaser, the coast-wise guidelines will be one of the strategies that we'll be highlighting as part of this coastal resilience plan. And finally, coast-wise guidelines are starting to be integrated into the programs of our regulatory agencies. So Army Corps and Maine DEP have been involved in conversations around these guidelines, and we'll be likely adopting them as voluntary standards for road crossing projects in the future. I know that Army Corps updated their guidance last year a little bit for their permits, and I think you're going to see more of that moving forward. So next slide, please, Abbie. Just want to thank all the organizations that contributed to development of the Tidal Restriction Atlas, and you can see them here. And the final slide, thank you all for attending today. Maine Coastal Program appreciates organizations that want to use the data for planning or research to please engage with them. They can help guide those efforts. And Slade Moore is the Habitat Restoration Coordinator for Maine Coastal Program. Please reach out to him with any questions, not me, I'm just the presenter. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jake, for that great presentation. And thanks to all of our speakers for their wonderful presentations and overviews of all of the great resources and tools that exist to help support resilience planning. So we are a few minutes behind schedule. So I think what we'll do is we'll open it up to questions right now for any of the presenters about the topics and tools that they presented on. And then for anybody who needs or wants to take a break, please feel free to take a roughly 2-minute break, and then we'll try to dig into the next section talking about moving forward around 11:35 or 11:37 if possible. So if folks have questions and they want to ask them over video, please click on the reaction tab at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand and we can call on you. Or if you feel more comfortable plugging your question into the chat, please feel free to do that. And for anybody who is able and feels comfortable with turning their video on for this section, that would be great too. So I see we have Chris Fort has her hand up. So go ahead, Chris. Oh, you're still muted.
Thanks, Abbie. I have a question for Pete about, I'm just going to call it the overtop potential tool that you showed. When you guys developed that, what did you envision it being used for?
To get a sense of basically vulnerability of structures adjacent to the shoreline. That was one thing, but also to get a sense of where dunes could be restored to elevations that would be adequate to protect from a 100-year storm event. The guidance that's given is when dunes are restored, they try to be restored to about base flood elevation, but preferably 1 foot above base flood elevation. So again, this is a shot using LiDAR, so it's using data from, I think, 2014 or 15, so it's already old. That dune crest may have been eroded or migrated already, but it's the best data we had at the time. But it's really to give an idea of, how protective are our walls? Are all of them below base flood elevation? And same thing with our dunes. But the idea with the dunes is to pinpoint those areas that could be restored.
Great, that's perfect. Thanks, Pete.
Yep.
All right, Jamie, I see your hand is up as well.
Yeah, if there's not another question, Abbie, I was just going to add on to that. I think that the tool that Pete described is extremely valuable. Until we actually have full hydrodynamic modeling for this area that incorporates sea level rise, we're not going to really understand the potential impacts of wave overtopping. So this is a great proxy for that. We've seen communities in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, they really suffer from overtopping, and the data that we have to support that, like standard sea level rise mapping, doesn't capture that sort of process. So this is a great way to start getting at that issue.
Great,
Thanks, Jamie. That's a great addition.
And we have a few comments in the chat that came in, one from Jen Hunter about the introduction presentation, that it would be great if the economic analysis part included the value of ecosystem services to coastal economies, even in a general way. And that's a great comment. So thank you, Jen, for that. And then there was another comment from Megan Daly that came in about Jeremy Gabrielson's presentation, I believe, saying that it's a great example from Mount Desert Island about combining community needs such as affordable housing with strategic land conservation. So are there any other questions from folks? I see another question just came in from Jerry in the chat. Is there any process to modify the sea level rise scenarios over time? The current Maine one uses RCP 4.5 for the best guess. There seems to be some opinions out there that we are approaching something in between 4.5 and 8.5. I think I'll give that to Pete and or Jamie if you want to try to answer that.
I'll start off and Jamie jump in, but Maine is revisiting the sea level rise scenarios on a 4-year basis, associated with basically the way Maine won't wait is going to be updated. So, and we also are tying this to data that's coming out of a lot of the national federal organizations like NOAA, USGS, and other organizations working on this to develop sea level rise scenarios in support of the U.S. National Climate Assessment. So the next time that data is getting updated, it's actually getting updated now and possibly going to be released sometime in 2022. So the idea is to be able to update the scenarios, which are becoming more and more regionalized. They used to be just global. Now they're regionalized, and we now have data with our tide gauges and with tools to be able to localize those to the tide gauges in Maine. So we do plan on updating those as numbers become available.
Right. Thank you all for those questions and comments, and thanks to the presenters for the responses. If folks have additional questions, it would be great if you could pop those into the chat, and we'll try to get to them at the end and or respond to them in the meeting notes, so that we can move on to our next section. And Danny Boudreau is going to kick us off again, talking about moving forward and how communities are addressing impacts and utilizing some of the tools and resources out there to advance coastal resilience. So go ahead, Danny.
All right, thank you, Abbie. So I'm just going to briefly kind of move us past kind of the vulnerability piece and the exploration of changes in local conditions, given that this project, ultimately, the goal is to actually have a resilience plan with a focus on nature-based strategies. And I'm just going to be very brief about this because I think, this is a component that obviously is going to be discussed in the coming months. And so the Office for Coastal Management is happy to come back and further explore this topic, but we just wanted to make sure that people have a basic understanding of what's out there, and once you get to the point where you're actually identifying adaptation options. So nature-based solutions can be used to reduce risk and build a community's resilience. And when I say nature-based solutions, the way our office defines it is it's the preservation of the natural environment, and it's a strategy that mimics natural processes. And so this can have lots of co-benefits for the environment, for recreation, for water quality. The nice thing about nature-based solutions is that they address multiple vulnerabilities, not just climate change, and help us to conserve and preserve habitat. Now, nature-based solutions, there's lots of different terms this is referred to as, right? It's green infrastructure, and it's natural infrastructure. Many, many different terms are used for this. Try not to get too caught up in terminology. It really depends on the audience you're talking to. So just kind of as you talk through this, maybe just think through what audiences might use different terms, such as green infrastructure is often used by city planners. Best management practices, we've heard the gamut. But in this presentation, I'm just going to say nature-based solutions. And as mentioned, the reason that it's just important to kind of wrap up and think about this right here is that as you move from the explore local changing conditions and assessing your vulnerability, you're going to be moving into the identifying adaptation options. And earlier on in the presentation, I quickly went through some resources on the Digital Coast and that you can access at your leisure. But there are a whole suite that are specific to nature-based solutions. So we have many quick references that go over the practices and benefits of nature-based solutions, that go over the installation and maintenance costs, and we even have tips for the non-economist. So thinking of costs and benefits of natural infrastructure. So we have tons of quick references that can be accessed as you begin to move into assessing nature-based solutions. And we've even talked with Annie and Abbie about the potential for further training if it's identified as a need. We have both a virtual and in-person training on using nature-based solutions for coastal hazards to reduce your community's risk to coastal hazards. The virtual training obviously is a little bit more basic. It's a 2-hour training on nature-based solutions, and then the in-person is a full-day training where you actually dive more deeply into a whole gamut of benefits, challenges, costs, partners, and actually work through designing a green infrastructure strategy throughout the day. And then we also have a self-guided resource that you can actually go to our website and start to work through. This is actually when we have our trainings that are that I just mentioned, both virtual and in person. We actually have the participants go to the website and go through this self-guided resource that will take you through the basics of green infrastructure. And you can kind of go through this training on your own. It's online and it's available. So just to give you a sense of what's on the digital coast, like I said, when you get to this point in your resilience planning process, Abbie and Annie and I and the rest of the team can kind of figure out how we can best support you. But wanted everyone to be aware that these are available, and happy to share links and resources to these as you think through what might be needed. And I'll just put one last plug in there for Jamie and I. We are more than happy to answer questions about anything on the Digital Coast. There's a lot on there. We know it's hard to find. So feel free to reach out to us, as we're more than happy to offer up some assistance in finding what resources work for you. Okay, I'll hand it back to Abbie.
Thank you, Danny. And I'm going to hand it back over to Pete for one more quick overview of some living shorelines work.
Which screen am I using? Okay, there we go. All right, hi again, everyone. Try to be really quick here. I really wanted to touch base on a couple just case studies of what we call nature-based solutions, or in this case, I'll call them living shorelines. Living shoreline really is an array of things, kind of like Danny described, but they use mostly native material, incorporates vegetation, sometimes in concert with some harder type of structure. But the key is that they maintain a natural connection between the land-water interface, as opposed to just holding the line, which is a lot of what our hard armoring does. 3 examples I'm going to provide are from eroding dunes, eroding bluffs, and eroding marshes. That pretty much covers the gamut of things that are eroding along the southern Maine coastline. The first is a case study that was developed as part of work with the other 5 New England states and the Nature Conservancy for dune restoration. This is one of the most effective methods of holding the line and mimicking natural processes that can be done along the open beach coastline. This is an example from Saco. There was an 800-foot stretch of dune which was heavily eroded after the Patriot storm of 2007. The erosion rate at this dune is about 2 to 3 feet per year. So instead of traditionally building up the front dune, which traditionally done, we suggested that they actually build up the back dune. That's what they did, and this example of a living shoreline is still there and still functioning quite well given the high erosion rate. Next, I want to touch on a couple projects that we've done with a variety of different stakeholders in Casco Bay, looking at bluff and marsh erosion. This is an example from Lanes Island of an eroding bluff, a heavily eroding bluff, as you can tell. The question we asked ourselves is, can we beneficially reuse materials on site to create a living shoreline? And in this case, we wanted to reuse trees. So working with a consultant, the idea was to take the existing really steep, unstable bluff, regrade it, which is what's traditionally done, but instead of putting tow riprap in, which is what's traditionally done, build what we call the stepped crib that beneficially reuses the trees. The excess material from regrading the bluff will be put in these steps, and then root balls will be put in the first step, and then everything would be planted with native vegetation going up the slope. Construction was done by a contractor because we had to use heavy equipment for this. This just shows you an example of the construction process. And this is an aerial image from Rick Harbison at GPCOG of the finished living shoreline. It's only 50 feet. This could have been 500 feet, but it's a demonstration treatment. The first step has eroded and it has provided sediment to the beach as it's supposed to, but the second and third steps are doing relatively well. The problem is the rest of the shoreline is eroding very rapidly. But the whole concept is still transferable. For marshes, we had a site in Brunswick at McCoy Bay Conservation Lands. This is kind of an eroding marsh edge, very, very common to the rest of the Maine coastline as well, that are exposed to either currents or fetch from wind. So the idea here was to, again, use a short, small demonstration treatment that beneficially reuses trees and uses natural materials as much as possible, but in conjunction with some synthetic materials. So the idea here was to develop a living shoreline that used a georeef gabion basket filled with oyster shell, and then coir bags filled with oyster shell. But we wanted to include what are called tree runners, which are these shore perpendicular trees. They're 10 to 12 feet in length, 10 to 12 inches in diameter, and put in place to break up ice, which actually gouges out the shoreline during the winter months. So this is kind of what that looked like from an existing condition standpoint. You had the eroding marsh edge with slump blocks. The idea was to put the logs in place and then fill shell bags underneath. And then in areas where we were testing this georeef, we wanted to fill that with oyster shell, also underneath the logs. Construction was done by volunteers over a period of like 3 or 4 days. And this is kind of what it looked like during construction. Logs were floated in place first. The georeef was put in place and then filled with oyster shell, and then bags were brought in and put in between and under all the logs and secured with rope. This is kind of what it looks like after the construction. It's done very, very well. Over the year and a half that it's been in place, we've had to replace the twine and replace about 6 bags. Everything else has done very well. So those are the examples I wanted to share with you in the 5 minutes I had. We have a lot of other resources that it's on this PDF that I'm sure will be shared from the project website for more information. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pete and Danny, for giving those very quick overviews. I think they highlight a lot of great resources and projects that have already been done in Maine that we can use to inform our regional resilience planning efforts, and uses some transferable strategies once we get a better idea about what the impacts are going to be in southern Maine and what our vulnerabilities are. So I know that was a ton of information, and hopefully it just provided an overview about some of the tools, resources, and data that we have at our disposal for this project. And hopefully prompted some ideas about different things that you all would like to see come out of this project. So for the last 10 or so minutes, we're going to give everybody an opportunity to share thoughts and input about, again, what they would like to see out of this project. So we have a Google Jamboard for folks to plug their written comments in. If people feel more comfortable writing them in the chat in this Zoom, that's fine. So Annie, if you want to go ahead and pop the link to the Jamboard in the chat, and I will screen share to provide an overview about how to use the Jamboard. Okay, so here we go. So this is a Google Jamboard. You don't have to be logged into Google to use it, but I think it does work best in the Google Chrome browser. So we have 4 Jamboard pages here that you can navigate through them with the arrows at the top. And we've posed certain questions that we'd like to get your feedback on. So people can add thoughts by either clicking on this sticky note button here and typing your thought in, and then clicking save, and it pops up on the Jamboard. Or there's a text box here as well that you can use to enter your thoughts and ideas, and go ahead and just spend some time navigating through those tabs to enter what you think we should focus on through this project and the different components of the project. And one of the objectives of this regional effort is really to link a lot of different priorities and needs from the 10 municipalities that are participating in the project, as well as land trusts and regional and state conservation organizations and other stakeholder groups, so that we are getting at everybody's needs and priorities to the maximum extent possible. And trying to ensure that we're incorporating multiple priorities into the vulnerability assessment, as well as the projects that are identified through the resilience planning effort. So we would really like to see know what you would like to see come out of this project. The other thing that I'll mention that sort of goes back to one of the survey questions I was talking about earlier in terms of what stakeholders we're hoping to see more of in southern Maine in the next 10 to 30 years, which was development directed away from at-risk areas, and also conservation and preservation of habitat and natural resources. So in addition to the great trainings and tools that Danny just gave an overview about, and the Living Shorelines demonstration projects that Pete presented, there's also an ongoing project to develop some model coastal resilience ordinance language right now. And that project is really focused on how to integrate climate change considerations and resilience measures into existing land use regulations and requirements. So we're looking at how the floodplain ordinance, shoreland zoning, site plan subdivision requirements, and also wetland conservation ordinances can be improved to better account for coastal hazards and integrate resilience considerations, and also developing some model language for a coastal resilience overlay zoning district. So those are all efforts that hopefully will inform this regional project and help us to develop some strategies and solutions that address the region's vulnerabilities for coastal hazards. So I will stop talking now and give folks some time to enter their thoughts in the Jamboard. And I see that people are popping in lots of comments, so thank you for that. And this Jamboard will also stay open for the rest of the day. So if you don't get a chance to add your thoughts in now, or if you need some time to think about what you've just heard from all of these presentations and come back later to add your thoughts, please feel free to do that. We will also summarize all of this information in the meeting notes. And another opportunity for providing input throughout the project, again, will be the project website that is being rolled out pretty soon here. We've had some technical glitches with getting it up and running and live, but we will send the link to that website out to all workshop participants with the workshop notes. Okay, and please feel free to continue adding thoughts to the Jamboard. I'm going to stop screen sharing this so that we can wrap up and also make note of a workshop evaluation that is going to be shared via the chat, I believe, and also sent out via email to all workshop participants. Oh, yep, Annie just plugged it into the chat. So that evaluation form will be really helpful to not only the NOAA Digital Coast partners, but also the project team to understand what worked well with this workshop, what can be improved, as well as what other topics and additional information would be helpful for future workshops, not only for this project, but just coastal issues in general in the region. So let's see, I have to pull up another PowerPoint here so I can just mention next steps for this regional coastal resilience project. Ooh. There we go. Okay, so as far as the project goes, we are still working to assemble socioeconomic data for the region and compile that in a way that can be integrated into the vulnerability assessment. We're also going to be working with a consultant to identify some of the key considerations for social and economic information that we can use for a prioritization scheme or framework to evaluate the vulnerable areas in the region, as well as evaluate and prioritize some of the resilience projects that are proposed through this project. Because again, we want to make sure that the efforts that we undertake are benefiting not only the natural environment and the built environment and economic considerations, but also account for social vulnerability and equity considerations. We will also be engaging a consultant to help us with that coastal vulnerability assessment in the next few months. The project advisory committee will help to guide the data and resources that feed into that assessment, but we will also be leaning heavily on the feedback that we receive through this workshop from working group members, as well as through our project website as to what people want to see included in that vulnerability assessment and how we can best utilize existing data and resources, some of which were highlighted during today's workshop, to inform our regional vulnerability assessment. Again, the project website is being rolled out very soon, and that link will be shared with you all. We also are planning a field trip for working group members to view areas in the region that are particularly vulnerable to coastal hazards, and also to view some areas where resilience projects have already been implemented, such as the dune restoration project that Pete highlighted in Ferry Beach in Saco, to get a better idea about what some of these projects look like on the ground and what the impacts of them are. We're also planning to hold a focus group with local youth to make sure that we are accounting for their perspective and input in this project, because they're a really important stakeholder group that can be difficult to engage through traditional means. So we're hoping to work with partners to engage some of the youth in the area. And then again, also planning to hold future trainings and some of the topics that Danny provided an overview on through the NOAA Digital Coast include adaptation planning, taking a deeper dive into nature-based solutions, and also potentially funding resilience projects at the local level. So you will be receiving meeting notes from this workshop and also an outline of the next steps for the project. And if you're a working group member, you'll receive an add-on email that will include a bit more detail, and everyone will receive the link to the project website. Annie, is there anything you want to say before we close about the survey?
No, just thanks to all of our presenters and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Yeah, a big thank you to everyone for spending 2 hours with us today and getting a lot of information thrown at you. So thank you very much. And we look forward to moving forward with you all in this very important regional effort. So thank you, everyone. I think we'll close out the workshop now. And for any comments or questions that came in on the chat that we didn't get to, we will be sure to address those in the meeting notes. So thanks again and have a good day. Bye.